Is it okay for the church to get involved in the public arena? Should Christians be actively involved in the free elections of the United States of America? Faith Wins is an organization dedicated to engaging pastors, congregations, and Christians in the public arena. Why, you may ask? Because the influence of Christians needs to be felt around this country. Jesus is the solution, and we need to bring biblical solutions to the marketplace of ideas before it's too late, and we need to do it now. There are over 80 million eligible Christian voters in this country, but only 30 million regularly participate in the elections. This needs to change, and Chad Connelly is going to tell you why in just a minute. Check us out online at faithwins.us. That's faithwins.us. When we sit on the sidelines and hope for a better future, the enemy wins. When we mobilize, register, and make our voices heard, faith wins every time. Welcome to the Faith Wins podcast. Faith Wins dedicated to engaging pastors, congregations, and Christians in the public arena. Why? Because the influence of Christians needs to be felt around the country in a positive way. In the 2024 election, this began to happen, but going forward, we need to move as one, being driven by biblical values that will be a blessing to everyone in our country. Chad Connelly's here today. As the founder of Faith Wins, he is dedicated to engaging believers in the political process by registering to vote and voting their biblical values. Today, we're going to talk about why are pastors afraid of politics? Why are they afraid to talk about it? I'm Jim Brangenberg, your host, and I'm joined today by Chad Connelly, the founder and president of Faith Wins. Chad, welcome back to the Faith Wins podcast.
What's up, Jim? How you doing, brother? Great to be here with you, man.
Chad, are we here on the Faith Wins podcast? Are we into bashing pastors?
No, of course not. We're trying to build them up and empower them, encourage them.
So then talking today, let's talk about why pastors are afraid of politics and making sure they know this isn't a bashing session. No. It's an encouragement podcast today. That's what it really is. All I know is that it seems to be pastors associated with more of the left side of politics seem to be not afraid to preach from the pulpit and be political from the pulpit. But it seems like conservatives on the right are afraid. Why? Why are they afraid?
Big question. And of course, I talk to pastors about this every single week. They've been attacked. Sometimes they get attacked from our side because they won't endorse. They get attacked by the other side because they're too conservative, too biblical. They have protests outside. Let's face it, we are dealing with an activist left right now that protests over sexual mutilation of children. They're standing for that. We always thought that people that stood for killing babies in a mommy's tummy was bad enough. Oh no, this is unbelievable. That they'll stand for and protest outside of your church that you must have feelings for this trans person. Well, the truth is we have feelings for the eternity, but we don't think you ought to be lopping body parts off of healthy children because they feel something different on a Thursday afternoon kind of thing. So I think a lot of it is the attacks. And let's face it, there's that group, Freedom From Religion Foundation, and it seems like every couple of years they write the obligatory letter, you must not be involved in politics, and they misquote Thomas Jefferson. They misquote the separation of church and state that came in a private letter to the Danbury Baptist years after the Constitution. They miss all the stories about God's role in America and how God's people were the most influential in the community. So I think that's a lot of it. And let's face it, the left is pretty good at paying and buying influence. We just saw this whole woke evangelicals thing in this past couple years. And when you start reading what they believe in and don't believe in, you realize that the real problem, Jim, is these people lack a biblical worldview anyway. And what I also think is I think politics has become the left's religion. I've been telling people, I heard a pastor say this, I forget what state I was in, it might have been Pennsylvania or Michigan this past cycle. He said, we're not getting political, but the political people have gotten spiritual. So therefore we better be strategic. We better be involved. We better be engaged. That's so true. When they start working and stealing our kids, I mean, you've probably seen this, state law now in some deep blue states, that if your child as young as 6 thinks they're supposed to transition to another sex instead of their biological God-given sex, and the parents disagree, the state can take your child from you. You probably saw this grandmother who was praying and protesting peacefully outside of an abortion clinic. She's in jail today. The president's son got pardoned, back before Christmas. And this grandmama who was praying quietly is in jail. I think she's 76. So politics has waded into the spiritual realm by doing things that are an affront to the to the spiritual world. And so I tell pastors all the time, you're already involved in politics. I don't believe my God is so small that he says, oh yeah, be involved in everything, go be salt and light, except politics. I think my God's big enough to be in everything all the time, 24/7, 365 days a year, except in a leap year, 366. God is big enough to be in everything. I think he calls his children to be in everything. So they've been lied to. They've been attacked. They've been hit upon by everything, sometimes from both sides of the political departments. But the fact of the matter is, it is our obligation. And when we go get involved and encourage others to be involved, we're actually doing our duty to God.
I think maybe your next 501c3 you should start would be Freedom Because of Religion Foundation.
Yeah. No kidding.
Really? Yeah. Why not?
It's a whole topic, because think about it. This goes into the educational system, right? Our educational system has failed us, that kids don't know the story of America or God's role or the Constitution or the Declaration. I think, what a lot of states are passing is you must read this stuff. You need to study this stuff again. That's the shame here, Jim, is if people don't realize what the founders said. And, in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Now, self-evident, as my buddy Bob McEwen says, that's Jeffersonian for any idiot should understand this. But the problem goes to truths. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator. In other words, there's something higher than the state. He's bigger than them. He's bigger than the state, and you got to bow to the state. That's why people that are political, not spiritual, and don't have a biblical worldview, they don't like the idea of God and freedom in the Lord, because they know you're actually saying there's somebody bigger than them. They want to hoard that power for themselves. And so Jefferson said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. You and I can walk into a room and we can argue over the size of the room. I can say, Jim, this room's 50 feet wide. You can say, well, I think it's 40. Just opinions. Until we pull out a measuring tape. Now we have a standard by which to measure it. Now we have the fact. And I believe what a lot of the fight is over is there's a fight over truth. And the reason is truth reveals error. And error hates truth and will always seek to suppress truth because they don't want competition. When you watch these lefties and the anti-God, anti-biblical, and really anti-America people, they cannot handle competition. They'll do all they can to suppress your word. They'll censor you. We saw this during the last political campaign. We've got to be careful. We had a major candidate of a major party. We've got to be careful about what people are allowed to say. What? Because this misinformation, it's not misinformation, it's truth. And we got to be able to allow people to seek out truth. Think about it. If you can't have freedom of speech, nothing else matters. You don't get anything. If you can't question authorities, if you can't question and ask those educated questions, there's no freedom in anything else either. I think that's what's going on. And so I think that's why people are empowered when we go out and do our meetings and pastors meet other pastors. But a lot of them are scared. They've been lied to. They've been misled. And let's face it, some of them, frankly, are cowards.
So who benefits from pastors staying silent on the issues being addressed in the political realm? Who benefits from pastors staying completely out of politics and encouraging their congregants to stay out of politics?
I think people that seek and want power all the time, anybody, and I'll say this, any pastor who's teaching truth that God's first, and he's above the state, is a threat to people who seek and want to keep power. And any time that the pastor's telling that truth, that God is supreme and, there are no other gods before him, that he's the creator of the heavens and the earth, that's a threat to statists. I've mentioned this before on the podcast. I wish every Christian would read Francis Schaeffer's book, The Christian Manifesto. I think he wrote it in 1971. I read it, reread it, taught it in my Sunday school class for a little while last fall, but he said the biggest threat to Christendom in the next generation in America is statism. And I remember scratching my head going, what? Now, I read it first in the 90s probably. Now I'm like, yes, because statism insists on dominance, and God, they have no place for God because the state's dominant, not God above.
Are there limits, though, to how much a pastor can exert his or her influence in the political arena? I mean, are there biblical limits? Are there legal limits? And are those the same or different?
Great question. So the biblical angle is this. People cannot name a book of the Bible, of the 66 books, that God's not having his leaders talk to, from, with, or be a political leader. It's constant throughout Scripture. And so when people say, well, he doesn't talk about politics, throughout the Bible, God's people are talking to, with, about, or they themselves are the political leaders of the day. So biblically, we're supposed to engage. I can't believe anybody would say, well, the Bible says steer clear of it. No, Jesus says to be salt and light. And rereading Matthew 5:13-16 is pretty clear. It says, if the salt has lost its savor, it's good for nothing, to be thrown in the street and trodden before the feet of men. Legally, you have so many more freedoms than most pastors would acknowledge. On our faithwinds.org site, we've got a link for church do's and don'ts. For instance, did you know that a church can literally lobby 15% of their time legally? So let's suppose my church has 5 full-time staffers, I believe, who work 40 hours a week. That's 200 hours a week. When do you think the last time was that our church spent 30 hours in any week down at the State House in South Carolina lobbying for an issue? Never.
I would say never.
And we're active. Never. And so if churches knew you literally could lobby 15% of your time, that's why I keep referring back to that church do's and don'ts list. You can absolutely do a nonpartisan voter registration. I had a pastor in some state last fall say, Chad, I don't want to be political. I said, good, pastor. We want you to be biblical, not political. And he said, well, I don't want to voter registration. I said, what's political about a nonpartisan voter registration? And he couldn't answer me. And so I think if we keep steering people toward what you can do and make them realize they've been lied to, what you can't do, here's the line, is if Chad Connelly's the pastor of Maple Street Baptist, I cannot stand in the pulpit and say, as pastor, I tell you, you must vote for. I can say, I'm going to take off pastor hat and I'm going to still stand here in the pulpit because I'm a pastor. I'm not a pastor, but I'm giving the story, right? As a pastor, I'm telling you, that's my title, but I'm telling you, here's who I'm going to vote for and why. And it's totally legal. And I'll bet you 90% of pastors don't even know what they can and can't do. They've been so misled and so lied to.
Wow. Those 5 sentences alone could transform the country because,
I think so.
Because 99.5% of the pastors, let's say conservative pastors in this country, think that it is illegal for them to do those 2 things you just said, that they absolutely they'd lose their 501c3 status if that happened.
There's a great other point that you just mentioned. Can you tell me, and we put this out before, can you tell me how many churches have ever lost their 501c3 status for political activity?
None.
It's 0. It's a finite number. It's exactly 0. Do you know that churches don't even need a 501c3 status from the IRS? And what pastors, and this is part of the relationships you and I have spent a lot of time talking about in the past, is when I have a relationship, I can go communicate to people a lot more effectively. There's a thing called Pulpit Freedom Sunday, started, 10, 15 years ago, where churches literally find the IRS line, cross it, send their transcript and recording or video of their sermon where they crossed the supposed IRS line and say, sue me. And the last time that was done was like 4,000 churches participated. And I've got one of the letters from the IRS. There's nothing to sue you over. And so people get that letter back. I got a copy of that because it's instructive to people. They don't want to sue you because they can't, because they know you're not crossing the line. It's the line that people think is there, but that's been built up by lefties who want to make sure the church isn't dominant in the culture.
So why should pastors speak about issues? I mean, right now, I got a local pastor here where I live who absolutely won't speak about any of the issues. Well, won't speak about anti-abortion, won't speak a trans lifestyle, won't speak about anti-gay. Won't speak about any of those things because he's afraid he'll damage the reputation of the church and lose. And this is a conservative church, is afraid he'll lose his nonprofit status. Why do pastors need to be speaking about issues?
Well, I wish you'd send him some of my stuff. I
you could bet this podcast going right to.
Yeah, I wouldn't send under a pastor not teaching truth. And listen, I think they shy away from it because they think, this is illegal or I can't do it. But here's the question I ask them is, Pastor, if you're not providing clarity in the culture, who is? And here's what I believe. A lot of this confusion that's been put on society, Jim, is intentional. It's coming from schools, from government, from families that are misled, from people that have a guilt complex, from people that don't have a biblical centric worldview. Their worldviews themselves, it's secular humanism or whatever. And so I believe, and I tell this to pastors all the time, you are the one person in that person's life that can provide clarity and connect the dots biblically. Here's what the Bible says. Here's what we're facing. I read a book, and I would challenge, there's two books actually that were very influential for me. The first one in the early 90s that I read was called Understanding the Times. And by the way, I'm putting a link on our website, faithwinds.org, for books that I read that I think will help people get clarity on this. Understanding the Times by Dr. David Noble at Summit Ministries in Colorado. It's a big, thick book with chapters, and it compares Christianity, humanism, Marxism, all the isms that people put their worldview on, they rested on. That was the one that helped me clarify, do I believe what I believe? The second one, which is a smaller book by George Barna called Think Like Jesus. I just bought a bunch of them to give to my core pastors. And Barna goes through, how do you define a Christian? What does a Christian believe? And he just goes through, Christian believes God is God, always is, always has been, always will be. The Bible is 100% true. Jesus lived a sinless life. Satan is real. He's not a cartoon character. We have an obligation to share our faith. I think it's 5 or 6 things like that. And if people are struggling over, did Jesus live a sinless life? They're out of the biblical worldview realm. If they're struggling with, Bible is a great story, but it's not all true. That's not a biblical worldview. So those two books, better than any other Christian books, help me clarify for me, how do I see this issue? Here's an issue we're looking at, and people, where do they get their influence? Their gates, their eyes, their ears. They're watching bad TV, pundits, polls, experts who don't share biblical worldview. And those books taught me to think through, okay, here's an issue. Let's talk about abortion. Here's an issue, and it's only one question. It solves every problem. Who says? It's only 2 answers to who says. Man says or God says. If man says, then man sets the standard, and we know how that moves. That's a sliding scale. But if the answer is God says, God is the standard. The Bible's the standard. He's the tape measure by which we can determine. So who says is the answer that after reading those 2 books, I started realizing I need to see an issue through a God lens, not a Chad lens, not a MSNBC or CNN or Fox News or ABC, CBS, NBC. I don't need to see it through those lenses. I need to see it through, how does God see this issue? How does God see abortion? He made life wonderfully and fearfully made, knit together in my mother's womb. He knew me before I was born. Those are pro-life statements that are direct correlations to the Bible that ought to make us go, every life is precious to God. Every life has purpose. Man says, woman says, it's my body, it's my choice. Well, no, there's a second body there. And so man says, and what man says is always going to fall short. needle distribution. This was one I did for years because I had a friend of mine take me to a needle distribution, a clean needle project in Hartford, Connecticut. And man says, okay, somebody's got a drug problem. Let's give them clean needles. God says, no, keep your body clean. Don't do things that influence your body that way. And I was telling this story, and the guy said, I want you to see this clean needle project. So we go to Hartford, Connecticut, right across from the Yale University football stadium. There was a drugstore where the government, you and I, tax dollars, man always falls short, they were giving out clean needles to junkies. And my buddy who lived outside of Hartford, he and I walked around the corner, Jim, and watched what the junkies did with the needles. You know what they did with them? They used them, shot up heroin, and guess what they did? They gave it to another junkie who was too high, too lazy, too whatever to walk around the front and get their own clean needle. They passed it on to somebody else. So our tax dollars at work are always a failure in things of the heart. God is the answer. God is the standard. If man's a standard, it's always going to be a moving target. If God's a standard, it's fixed and it's set and it's a true North Star.
So pastors, as you're listening today, you are no longer ignorant of the fact that you have permission to deal with these, to share these issues, to be bold from the pulpit and impact our culture. Our culture needs biblical values from one end to the other. You heard it from Chad Connelly, and you heard it right here on the Faith Wins podcast. Thanks, Chad.
God bless you, brother.
Thanks for listening to the Faith Wins podcast with Faith Wins founder Chad Connelly. Please check us out online at faithwins.org, faithwins.org. Your vote, your life is needed and necessary to engage in the system of free elections in the United States of America. If you're not registered to vote, take time to do so on your local county voter registration website. Find out when the next election is and consider running for office and run on biblical values. Till next time, remember, faith wins when people of faith vote their values.
Go to faithwins.org. My name is Chad Connelly. When I founded Faith Wins, it was to spread the truth that God's role in America is irreplaceable. Faith wins when people of faith vote their values. Our mission is laser focused on educating, activating, and mobilizing faith leaders, providing them with the tools, the resources, and the messaging to leverage their impact in the political and the governmental arenas. We cultivate, develop relationships with pastors who share the whole counsel of God, who stand for truth.
Hey, thanks for listening to the Faith Wins podcast with Faith Wins founder, Chad Connelly. I'm your host, Jim Brangenberg, and I want to ask you to check out Faith Wins online at faithwins.us. That's faithwins.us. Your vote is needed and necessary, and we all need to learn to engage in our system of free elections right here in the United States of America. If you're not registered to vote, please take time to do so on your local county voter registration website and do it today. In an upcoming election, vote for candidates supporting biblical values and a biblical worldview. Until next time, remember, when Christians engage in the public arena, faith wins.